Hey everyone, welcome to this version of the weekly check in. Again, it's been a while, but I hope that you have enjoyed those last few days of summer as things are turning into fall. Actually, this is one of my favorite times of year. My birthday is during the fall, so I kind of love these somewhat cooler days um, as things begin to change and really like that a lot. Now, I'm not going to like things that happen, you know, 3 months from now when we're probably knee deep in snow and it's 20 below, but right now it's good. So this weekend here at church, we are getting ready for kind of we don't call it Rally Sunday, but we are doing a blessing of the backpacks. And I hope that if you're able, that you'll join us at 11 a.m. And we worship at Roseville Lutheran Church in Roseville, Minnesota. But today I wanted to talk a little bit about prayer. Um, Unfortunately, we had a school shooting this week in Georgia. And it always seems like at some point, um, someone's always talking about how we don't need thoughts and prayers right now, that we need action. And that's always got me thinking about the role of prayer. And maybe back about 20 some years ago, this was at the fall of 2001. So I had just graduated from seminary, but I still, before I could get ordained, needed to take a what they call a practicum of clinical pastoral education, or CPE. For those of us, those people who are in our congregation at first, that's how it could be the first step to being a chaplain, but everyone who's a pastor usually has to take something like this. And so this was at the Ebenezer Transitional Care Unit in Minneapolis. And it was a very memorable time in my life. And one of my first visits, I can remember going into this room, and there was this family, and they were all gathered around this man. Um, Man was probably middle aged. I can remember him being bald. Um, and I remember that his head was rather swollen. A woman started to speak to me. I found out that this was this man's wife. And it turns out that this man had some type of a brain cancer. Um, and he was unresponsive, but she asked for prayer. She was adding, she added that she was hoping that at some point he could receive some physical therapy and that he would get better. Now, anyone who knows me knows that I am really bad at doing a poker face, but I really tried as hard as I could to conceal my amazement of what she had just said. I wasn't a doctor, but knowing that this man had brain cancer, that he was unconscious, I pretty much knew that some therapy just wasn't going to cut it. And I was nervous because I didn't know how in the world was I going to pray for this man. Didn't feel like I could just pray that a miracle would happen, but I had to do something. I was pretty sure this guy was going to die, but I didn't know if that was what I should tell this woman and the family who was there clinging on to some type of a hope. And I remember I prayed something. I have no idea what I prayed. And I finished and I left the room. I do know afterwards that this family probably came to some terms that physical therapy wasn't going to cut it, wasn't going to help him. I don't know if they ever got to the point of accepting that he was going to die and that maybe they needed to look at hospice. Um, but I think they knew that just physical therapy wasn't going to work. But I look back at that situation, I keep wondering how best should I respond. In some ways, I was trained, I went through seminary. In some ways, we were taught not to kind of preach a false hope. And in many ways, I still believe that. But I'm left with the question, what was the good news for that family? This family who was dealing with grief and denial, what was the gospel for them? And what role did prayer have in this incredibly desperate situation? You know, prayer is one of those things that we do, but especially if you're caught from a mainline Protestant perspective and mainline Protestant churches, or progressive churches. Sometimes prayer can feel like an appendix, like it's something that was there, but we really just don't know why we still do it. There's a friend of mine, Dave Watson. He's a Methodist minister. He said something years ago that kind of the belief in and the events of things like the Holocaust and I think also the nuclear bomb, the bombing of Hiroshima, made us doubt kind of the belief in the supernatural. And what happens now is that we kind of live in what the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor calls the immanent frame. And what that means is that we live in a place and time where we don't expect that God even acts in our world. Maybe we believe that God is there, but we don't see that God kind of comes in to our world to act. And so you think about that man lying in that bed in the transitional care unit. I, in some ways, was taught that God wasn't going to heal this man, that wasn't going to happen. And I'm left with questions. Why do we feel that way? Why do we think that prayer can't do anything? And why do we believe that God couldn't miraculously heal this man? I'm not saying that we should expect that that's going to happen in that way, but why don't we believe that? Maybe that wife was in denial of death, but she believed in some ways in a God that could act outside of the frame or the frames that we live in. The Methodist and pastor and theologian Jason Michelli has noted that Christians tend to not really believe that God can heal people. When he had a cancer diagnosis, and he is someone that kind of lives with cancer, he observed this, and this is, I want to kind of quote this. He said, quote, "When I first got cancer several years ago, I was astonished at the apparent unbelief in prayer by those who do it. Every person was sincere. It just goes to show how little sincerity has to do with discipleship. I'll pray that God gives you strength," people would tell me. "I pray that God will give your doctors wisdom," people told me. You're in my thoughts. Far too many Christians told me. Your thoughts? What the hell good are your thoughts going to do? I'm dying. Why don't you pray that God make it not so? Why don't you attempt to persuade God to heal me? And then he adds this: some did pray, and I am grateful. So some did so pray, and I am grateful for their prayers. End quote. And I've noticed this as well. I've done it as well. We pray for everything. We pray for um, that all of the wisdom, all of the that people that maybe just not accept healing, but accept their illness or whatever. But we don't pray for the most obvious thing, and that is for healing. Michelli is a friend with Stanley Hauerwas, which is another theologian. Stanley Hauerwas was not in good health. He was Michelli was getting ready to pray, and just before he goes in, Hauerwas says this: "If you're not going to pray for God to heal me, then hell, just hang up the phone now already." Jesus, in the first chapter of Mark, he's kind of going in this, he's beginning his public ministry, and he's in this place of worship. And all of a sudden, as he is preaching and teaching, he hears this shout. Everyone is astounded. And this is this man that has this demon in him. Um, I don't know how he got into the sanctuary, but that's another story. But the man is just making a scene. And so Jesus tells the spirit to come out. But one of the things that's interesting about this is that the demon says to Jesus, "I know who you are. You're the Holy Son of God." Jesus tells the man to shut up, or the demon to shut up and come out, and the evil spirit obeys. And the man is now healed. And the people are blown away. The evil spirit says to Jesus, I know who you are. And that's a fascinating question because do we know who Jesus is? Do we know who God is? I mean, this demon who meant ill for this man did not do anything good for this man, knew who Jesus was. But I wonder, do we know who God is? Do we know, and more, and also related to that is, do we know that we're the church? Do we know that we are a people that Jesus called to preach and teach and to heal the sick? We live in a world right now that is driven by fear. I go back to the school shooting I talked about earlier in this talk. We sometimes dismiss prayer and say, what's needed is policy. And probably we do. I'm not here to try to talk to you all about what type of policy is needed. That's not the point here. But why don't we believe that prayer can make a difference? Why don't we believe that prayer can make a difference in things like gun violence? Why don't we believe that prayer can make a difference in how our politicians respond to this tragedy? If all that we do is think that it's just on policy, then we're saying that God doesn't really matter. What matters is power. What matters is what goes on in DC, but not in our state capitals, but not what happens in our churches. Now, for some of you, this talk, what I'm doing seems familiar. It's because it's the basis of a sermon that I wrote back in January. January was an interesting time in my life because I was dealing with my mother who had had a stroke, and it was a rough time. And she was in great pain, especially in those last few weeks. And of course, as many as you know, she would die in late February. But I can remember on that time spending a lot of time in deep prayer, praying that mom would be healed. Now, maybe that was a little foolish considering the extent of mom's stroke, her age, and all of that. But I didn't want to just pray for the doctors or pray just for wisdom or what have you. I wanted to believe in that prayer for healing, for actual healing. Now, that prayer didn't get answered, and that's probably for another talk. But what I learned from that experience was to pray boldly, to believe that God could heal her. I think that it's time for us as Christians to learn and believe that God can work, that God can act in our world, and that God can do that through our prayer. God is not something that we just pray to and pray words, but we believe in a God that works, a God that came into this world in the person of Jesus Christ to love, to redeem, and to heal us. And we believe that God can do that again. So that's my talk for this week. I hope that when you go to prayer, whether that's on Sunday or any time that you go to prayer, to know that Christ prayer makes a difference. God is listening. God can act. It may not always be the way that we want, but God will act. That's it for this week. I know it's probably a little bit longer than usual, but I will be back again next week with some more thoughts. Take care, everyone. Godspeed. I'll see you soon.